Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are going straight to the source today, pulling apart one of the foundational texts of 20th century thought, Ludwig von Mises' monumental 1949 work, Human Action, a treatise on economics.
This book is, quite simply, an intellectual fortress built to defend liberty. Mises wrote it at a really critical historical juncture, right?
Absolutely. Post-World War II.
Right. After the horrors of two world wars and the massive, accelerating centralization of state power across the globe, he saw economic theory not just as an academic exercise, but really as the last stand against totalitarianism.
That context is just everything, isn't it? Mises wasn't merely attempting to describe how markets work. He was, articulating a complete economic system.
One that paralleled the founding principles of limited government, law, and property.
Yeah. Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to extract his complete articulation of Austrian economics and view it precisely through that lens as maybe the most rigorous, systematic defense of a free society ever written.
And Mises' starting point is, it seems simple on the surface. He goes right to the core. What is the source of all economic phenomena?
And his answer starts with us.
And the concept of human action, which he defines as purposeful choice under the condition of scarcity.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Purposeful choice under scarcity. If everything starts from the individual making a choice to move from, say, a less satisfactory state to a more satisfactory state.
To satisfy some felt uneasiness, as he puts it.
Right. Then the central question Mises addresses becomes profoundly philosophical and political, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The question boils down to this. Will human beings be free to act on their own reason and responsibility? Or will they be compelled, guided by some external authority?
Whether that's a dictator, a central committee, or even, a well-meaning bureaucracy.
Exactly. And Mises' answer, and this really echoes the wisdom of the classical liberal tradition, the American founders, it's unequivocal.
Liberty isn't just a nice-to-have political luxury.
No, it's the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for moral and material progress. Any system that tries to substitute coercion for voluntary action is, in his view, inherently irrational.
And doomed.
Destined to lead to economic decay and, eventually, social disintegration. That's the stark choice he presents.
So to build this intellectual fortress for liberty, Mises had to start by basically redefining economics itself. He argued his contemporaries were modeling it all wrong.
Which brings us nicely to our first part. Praxeology, the science of purposeful action.
Praxeology. It sounds academic, but what does it really mean?
Mises reestablished economics not as a branch of applied mathematics, crunching numbers, but as praxeology. That's the logical, a priori study of purposeful human behavior itself.
A priori, meaning not based on empirical observation.
Well, derived from the very concept of action, from logic. Before you even look at the data, it's a massive break from the sort of empirical, data-driven approach we often see today. He's studying the act of choosing, the logic behind it.
That's a crucial distinction. So when Mises talks about praxeology, he's not worried about why you want something, like the ultimate goal.
Exactly. He doesn't care if your end goal is spiritual enlightenment or just owning a fancy yacht. That's outside the scope of praxeology proper.
Okay. So what is he concerned with?
He's concerned with the means you apply to achieve that end, and how that application is determined by a rational consideration of expense, effort, and the likelihood of success. It's about the structure of action.
So we're talking about rational action, not just instinct or reflex.
Precisely. Although even seemingly irrational actions can be analyzed praxeologically. Mises gives an example, I think, of a peasant using magic rites for a good harvest.
Right, that doesn't sound very rational.
But the decision to use those rites as a means to an end a good harvest is still purposeful action. It's based on a belief, however flawed, and a causal relation. It's a choice, a theory about how the world works being applied to reality.
So action is inherently intellectual. It's always based on an idea, a theory, a causal hypothesis.
Yes. Mises argues action is always preceded by thinking. You can't act without some underlying theory about cause and effect. Action without theory is, for him, unimaginable.
So if you reject theory,
you effectively reject action itself, which is why he launches such a, devastating critique against the idea that economics should be treated like physics or other natural sciences.
Okay. Why does he fundamentally reject that natural science model? What's the problem with trying to make economics like physics?
Because the physical sciences operate on the assumption of constant relations. Things like the speed of light, gravity, they are measurable constants.
And you can test them in labs, controlled experiments.
Exactly. And Mises points out very forcefully that in the realm of human action, those constant relations simply do not exist.
Meaning you can't really measure human values or choices in the same way.
Precisely. You can't measure human value or choice like you measure the tensile strength of steel. It makes measurement in the scientific sense impossible for the core concepts of economics.
This is where it gets really interesting, especially for anyone who relies heavily on economic data or statistics.
Right. So if a statistician finds that, say, last quarter, a 10% rise in avocado supply led to an 8% price drop in a specific city.
That tells us something, doesn't it?
It tells us a unique individual historical fact. Mises calls this thymology, or understanding historical context, but it's not praxeology, it's history.
It's what happened then and there.
Yes, a fact of what Mises sometimes called taxes, an ordering, a unique instance. It does not establish a general, universally applicable statement or a constant elasticity that you can reliably use to predict avocado prices next month.
Because all the underlying factors are changing. Tastes, expectations, other events.
Constantly changing. So statistics describe history. They don't yield universal laws like physics.
Okay, so Mises grounds human cognition, our ability to understand reality, in two fundamental categories of thought.
Yes. He argues we can only grasp reality through two principles. Teleology, which is purposeful behavior, the domain of praxeology.
And causality,
which is the mechanistic physical relationship between cause and effect, the domain of the natural sciences.
And the beauty of this praxeological framework is that the very concept of action forces us to be rigorous, right?
Absolutely. Action, by its nature, implies a clear distinction, a separation between means and ends.
And between costs and proceeds, what you give up versus what you hope to gain.
Exactly. If you can't make that distinction, if you don't know what you gave up to get something, you aren't acting purposefully in the economic sense. You need that comparison.
Okay, before we move on to how this applies to society as a whole, we need to touch on his view of the social collective. This seems crucial for understanding Mises's politics.
It really is. Mises utterly dismisses the notion that society is some kind of, magical entity.
Like it has its own will, its own soul, separate from the people in it.
Precisely. He rejects that wholesale. Society is not an independent actor floating above individuals.
So what is it then?
It's simply the result, the outcome, of individual actions. Specifically, the actions that constitute cooperation under the division of labor.
It emerges spontaneously, not through some grand plan from the top.
Exactly. It's a bottom-up phenomenon. And why does it emerge? Because, quite simply, work under the division of labor is fundamentally more productive than everyone trying to do everything for themselves in isolation.
So social cooperation becomes a common concern because it benefits everyone involved. It helps individuals achieve their own ends more effectively.
That's the core idea. Society, for Mises, is essentially a highly efficient means to individual ends. It's about cooperation for mutual benefit.
Now, what's fascinating here is how Mises connects this rational view of society back to what he called the revolt against reason.
Ah, yes. He saw certain ideologies, socialism, fascism, radical collectivism, as needing to reject the idea of universal reason to even maintain their premises.
Because they promote this idea of a collective will, something separate from individuals.
Right. And to justify overriding individual reason and choice, they often resort to what Mises termed polylogism.
Polylogism, many logics.
Exactly. It's the assertion that different groups, social classes, races, nations, possess fundamentally different logical structures. Their minds literally work differently.
You see that in, say, Marxist theory claiming proletarian logic is different from bourgeois logic.
Precisely. Or in racist ideologies claiming certain races have a unique, non-universal way of thinking. It makes the arguments of the other group invalid by definition, simply based on their identity.
So it's a way to shut down debate.
Mises saw it as exactly that, a way to silence critics without engaging in argument. Your logic doesn't apply because you're from Group X.
But the rationalist position, Mises' position,
is that universal reason is the only tool we have for cognition. A sound theory has to be universally correct or incorrect. It can't be valid for a bourgeois if it's invalid for a proletarian, or vice versa.
So reason is universal.
As far as man can attain cognition, Mises insists he must rely on that universally valid structure of human reason. It's the common ground for all discourse.
Okay, so if economics isn't physics, if it's built on this foundation of universal, purposeful, individual action, what does that mean for how we should organize society?
Now we get to the heart of it. That brings us to part 2, where the real defense of liberty emerges. The market as the economic constitution of liberty.
The economic constitution. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. And this is the genius of Mises. His defense of the market isn't just about, maximizing widgets or GDP. It mirrors the essential design principles of the U.S. Constitution.
How so? What's the parallel?
Both are systems designed to establish rules, not rulers. They're frameworks built to manage inherent human limitations: self-interest, imperfect knowledge, scarcity.
That parallel is incredibly strong. The founders knew, as Madison famously said, that men aren't angels, so they designed the Constitution to divide and limit political power through checks and balances.
And Mises shows that the free market does the exact same thing for economic power. It disperses it, decentralizes decision-making.
So both systems depend on what? Law instead of arbitrary will.
Exactly. Law instead of will, and contracts instead of commands. In a contractual society, which is Mises' ideal, the individual isn't bound to obey an overlord or a central planner.
If they serve others, they do it voluntarily.
Entirely of their own accord, yes. To be rewarded through voluntary exchange. Dependence becomes mutual. The buyer needs the seller needs the buyer. That is liberty in the Misesian sense.
And this leads directly to Mises' concept of consumer sovereignty, right? He talks about this in Catalactics, The Science of Exchange.
That's right. If you're looking for the real boss, the true captain of the economic ship, Mises says don't look at the capitalists or the government. Look at the consumers.
It's you, the listener, making purchasing decisions.
Absolutely. The consumers are the captain. Entrepreneurs, capitalists, managers, they are merely the crew, bound to obey the consumer's orders as conveyed by market prices.
And if they disobey, if they produce something nobody wants,
they suffer losses. It's an immediate impersonal feedback mechanism. There's no arguing with the market's verdict, ultimately.
Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Mises often calls the market a democracy.
Yes, but he argues it's a far more responsive and effective form of democracy than the political sphere.
How? Because every penny counts.
Every penny spent functions like a vote, influencing production processes continuously. Think about political voting. If 49% vote for a candidate who loses,
their votes are essentially ineffective for the term of office.
Right. But on the market, every minority interest can be effective, provided that minority is willing to pay the cost.
He uses that great example of publishers, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Profit-seeking publishers know the majority might read, say, detective stories. But the market structure compels them to also cater to the minority reading lyrical poetry or obscure philosophical tracts.
As long as that niche interest covers the costs of production.
Exactly. The market doesn't just produce for the masses. It serves the incredibly diverse, sometimes eccentric desires of everyone capable and willing to pay.
Which demands a very specific kind of function from the people running businesses, the entrepreneurial function.
Yes, and we often confuse the entrepreneur with, say, the manager running daily operations or the inventor coming up with a new gadget. Those are important, but distinct.
So what is the specific entrepreneurial function for Mises?
It's about dealing with uncertainty about the future. The specific entrepreneurial profit or loss isn't generated by the sheer quantity of physical output or technical brilliance.
It comes from
success or failure in anticipating the future state of the market, anticipating what consumers will want and how best to provide it before it's obvious to everyone else.
So the entrepreneur is this proactive leader using foresight to steer resources, land, labor, capital to where consumers will most urgently want them tomorrow.
That's the crucial role, adjusting production today to meet the expected demands of tomorrow. And Mises insists this function cannot be replicated by any bureaucratic planning committee. It requires judgment under uncertainty and skin in the game.
Skin in the game. Which brings us back to economic structure and accountability. Mises recognized that the resulting inequality in wealth and income, which many criticize,
he saw it as an essential feature of the market economy. Not a bug, but a feature.
Why would inequality be necessary for liberty? That sounds counterintuitive.
Because that financial pressure, the constant threat of suffering losses if you misjudge the market, is the only impersonal mechanism that guarantees efficiency and compels the entrepreneur to relentlessly serve the consumer better than competitors.
If you remove that consequence, failure doesn't mean losing your own money.
then entrepreneurs are essentially gambling with other people's money, or the state's money. They become less careful, less responsive, more prone to waste, and pursuing pet projects instead of consumer desires.
Mises puts it very bluntly, doesn't he? He says the only alternative to this impersonal financial pressure of the market
is direct compulsion by police power, force. If you want resources allocated by something other than profits and losses reflecting consumer wants, you must allocate them by command and coercion. There's no third way in his framework.
So the core takeaway here is that liberty, real freedom, is guaranteed only by actively defending these fundamental institutions of the market economy.
That's his argument. Mises believed that the freedoms enjoyed in Western democracies weren't primarily the result of beautifully written constitutions alone.
What were they the result of, then?
Those documents primarily safeguarded a liberty that was already being generated and sustained by the underlying operations of the market economy, if you destroy the market foundation.
The constitutional guarantees become just words on paper.
They become a dead letter, as he put it. The economic system underpins the political possibilities.
Wow. Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for Mises' central warning, the real cornerstone of the whole treatise. What happens when that economic structure of liberty is violated?
Exactly. This brings us to part 3, dealing with the inherent, inescapable failure of coercion in economic life.
And we have to start with the argument that really put Mises on the intellectual map decades before human action.
The economic calculation argument against socialism. This wasn't just saying socialism was bad or inefficient. Mises argued it was logically and scientifically impossible to achieve rationally.
Because socialism, defined as state ownership of all the means of production,
lacks 2 absolutely essential prerequisites for rational economic planning. First, private property in the means of production.
And because there's no private property, there can be no real markets for capital goods, factories, machines, raw materials.
Which means no genuine market prices for those factors of production.
And without those monetary prices,
there could be no rational allocation of scarce resources. The central planner, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned, simply cannot determine what to produce, how much to produce, or which technological method is the most economically efficient.
They can't compare the costs of different options.
They can't. They can't calculate costs against expected revenues or benefits because they don't have the common denominator of money prices reflecting relative scarcities and consumer valuations. They are, as Mises famously said, groping in the dark, flying blind.
Now, that sounds maybe overly simplistic to modern ears. People might think, well, today we have supercomputers. Big data, surely we can calculate this now.
Mises anticipated this line of argument decades before powerful computers existed and dealt with it brilliantly.
How?
He acknowledged that technology can certainly provide technical data. An engineer can tell you how thick a steel plate needs to be for a bridge to hold a certain weight.
Or the chemical formula for a compound. That's objective information.
Right. Technology deals with objective use value, the physical properties of things. But, Mises argues, technology is utterly at a loss to tell us which productive procedures we should choose out of the practically infinite variety of possibilities available.
To best satisfy human wants, our felt uneasiness.
Exactly. Technical efficiency is not the same as economic efficiency. A machine might be a marvel of engineering, technically perfect. But if producing it uses up resources that consumers would have preferred be used for something else entirely,
or if it costs 10 times more than people are willing to pay for its output,
then it's economically wasteful, regardless of its technical perfection. The planner still faces the fundamental economic question. Is pursuing Project A worth sacrificing the resources that could have gone into Project B or C? Which use best serves consumer desires?
And only monetary calculation, using market prices derived from private property and voluntary exchange, can answer that critical economic question of value and opportunity cost.
Precisely. It's the only way to compare apples and oranges, so to speak, in terms of their value to consumers.
And Mises takes this calculation argument even further, right? Addressing the complexity of time and existing capital.
Yes. Even if you granted the socialist director miraculous omniscience, let's say he somehow knew exactly what the final desired state of the economy should be, like a perfect blueprint.
Even then, she'd fail.
He would still fail in practice. Because the existing wealth of society isn't just raw materials. It largely consists of past capital goods, factories, tools, infrastructure.
Things built years ago under different conditions and for different purposes.
Exactly. And utilizing this inherited wealth efficiently requires calculation. These old capital goods aren't perfectly adaptable or interchangeable for new projects.
You can't just plug old factory into an equation. You need to know the opportunity cost. Is it better to keep using this old factory for product A, refit it for product B, or scrap it and build something new?
Right. That requires comparing its potential contribution in various uses against the costs, using monetary prices. Without calculation, the director is just guessing how best to use the accumulated capital of the past, inevitably leading to misallocation and the gradual consumption of capital.
As Mises concludes, to plan human life is to destroy it. Chilling.
It is. And this fundamental failure of calculation doesn't just apply to full-blown socialism. It also plagues the attempts at a middle way, what Mises called interventionism.
This is the mixed economy idea, trying to keep private property but fix the market's supposed flaws with government intervention.
Yes, and Mises argues interventionism rests on a fundamental logical error, which he famously called the Santa Claus fallacy.
The Santa Claus fallacy, I like that. What is it?
It's the naive idea that the government is some kind of entity above the social process, possessing a magical source of funds or goods that it doesn't actually get from its own citizens.
Like Santa bringing gifts from the North Pole, not from the parents' bank account.
Exactly. All government spending, Mises points out, must ultimately come from somewhere within the economy, either through taxing citizens, borrowing from them, or foreigners, or inflating the currency.
Which all involve taking resources away from private individuals and their chosen uses.
Correct. There's no free lunch, no magic pudding the government can draw from. It's always a reallocation of existing resources.
And Mises shows how even seemingly limited interventions tend to unravel, pushing the government further down the path towards total control. His case study of price controls is classic.
It really is. Let's say the government fixes the price of a vital good, like bread, below the level the free market would have set.
To make it affordable.
Right. But this immediately disturbs the equilibrium of supply and demand. At the artificially low price, demand will skyrocket, while producers might find it unprofitable to supply as much. You get shortages.
So price can no longer do its job of allocating the bread.
Correct. People want to buy it, even at the regulated price, or maybe higher, but they can't find any. Mises points out the government is then forced into the next step, imposing rationing.
Or else it's just first come, first served, long queues, maybe even black markets or violence deciding who gets the scarce bread.
Exactly. And the interventionist spiral doesn't stop there. If you only control the price of bread, the bakers, facing losses, will struggle to afford flour, labor, and energy, whose prices aren't controlled yet.
So to keep bread production going, the government has to
control the price of flour, then the wages of bakers, then the price of wheat, fertilizer, tractors, step by step. To make the initial price control work, the controls have to spread until the entire economy is effectively planned and controlled by the state.
Mises actually points out this isn't just theory. He argues this dynamic was a major factor in the economic decline of the Roman Empire.
Yes, the pervasive price controls under Diocletian, coupled with currency debasement, choked off trade and production, contributing heavily to the decline of ancient civilization, as he put it. History provides grim examples.
And he applies similar logic to interventions in the labor market, like wage controls.
Right. Attempts to fix wage rates above the level where supply meets demand, the potential market clearing rate,
lead inevitably to what he calls institutional unemployment.
Some workers whose productivity doesn't justify the mandated high wage simply won't be hired. The price of their labor is too high relative to their expected contribution.
So the intervention creates unemployment. Then the government has to deal with that.
Which usually means implementing assistance programs, unemployment benefits, or doles.
And Mises has a sharp warning about those too, doesn't he? About the incentive structure.
A very sharp warning. If those unemployment benefits are set too close to the potential market wage rate, they fundamentally alter the incentives. They make it economically less painful, perhaps even preferable for some, to remain idle rather than take an available job at a market wage.
So temporary cyclical unemployment can become permanent, long-term institutional unemployment that persists.
That's the danger he highlights. The government intervention, intended to help, ends up creating a chronic problem by disrupting the market's adjustment process and weakening the incentive to work.
Okay, this relentless logic of intervention leading to failure brings us to part 4. Here, Mises tackles one of the most crucial, yet often misunderstood, areas impacting liberty: money.
Yes, and he views sound money very much like the American founders did, as a critical safeguard against political overreach and abuse.
He strongly defended sound money, explicitly connecting it to the founders' constitutional insistence on gold and silver as legal tender. He actually calls the gold standard the watchdog of liberty.
A watchdog. It provides an external, objective check against large-scale inflationary schemes by governments wanting to spend more than they can easily tax or borrow openly.
Because under a gold standard, the government can't just print infinite amounts of money. It's tied to a real commodity.
Exactly. The genius of gold, Mises argued, is that it's an international money. Its value isn't determined by one government's decree. A single government can't easily abolish it worldwide.
So as long as gold has value internationally, it constrains the domestic government's ability to just inflate its own currency without facing consequences, like gold flowing out or the exchange rate collapsing.
Precisely. It anchors the domestic price structure, to some extent, to world prices, limiting the political room for reckless inflation.
But once that anchor is cut, as it largely has been, Mises identified a huge danger.
The moral fraud of inflation. And let's be clear, when Mises talks about inflation, he means specifically a cash-induced increase in the quantity of money and credit. Rising prices are the typical consequence, not the definition itself.
Okay, and why is this increase in the money supply a moral fraud?
Because it's the hidden mechanism that allows governments to finance huge deficits for wars, welfare programs, whatever, and effectively bribe electorates with spending, all without imposing direct, visible taxes that would be politically unpopular.
It's taxation by stealth.
It is. And here Mises exposes the really insidious mechanism of how inflation works, something that needs to be understood. It's not just that all prices rise equally.
It acts as a subtle but devastating hidden transfer of wealth. It shuffles the cards of wealth distribution unfairly.
Exactly. Mises clearly described what economists later call the Cantillon effect. Inflation is a forced transfer. Some people get richer. Specifically, those who receive the newly created money first. Think government contractors, banks involved in credit expansion, politically connected groups. They get to spend the new money before prices have fully adjusted upwards. They benefit from buying cheap.
While others are impoverished?
Yes. Those whose incomes lag behind, people on fixed salaries, pensioners, savers holding cash, workers whose wages don't rise as fast as the prices of the goods they need to buy, they face higher prices before their income catches up, if it ever does.
So the entire price structure gets distorted, silently changing who holds wealth and purchasing power.
It's a profound hidden form of expropriation. Mises specifically warns that sustained credit expansion and inflation frustrate the saving attempts of ordinary people, the common man.
And it erodes the value of endowments for charities, universities, hospitals, institutions relying on fixed income assets.
Absolutely. It silently confiscates their purchasing power. Mises considered it fundamentally dishonest theft, masked as monetary policy.
And this theme of financial accountability, or the lack thereof under inflation, connects directly back to the broader moral dimension that permeates human action.
It does. For Mises, freedom wasn't license. It was inextricably linked with responsibility. The free market demands that individuals bear the full consequences of their own choices. Success brings profit. Failure brings loss. If your business venture fails, you lose your investment. You are accountable.
And this personal accountability is the bedrock of moral order in a free society.
That's his contention. It fosters prudence, diligence, and respect for property and contracts.
But what happens when the state steps in with large-scale welfare policies and aims to shield people from the consequences of their actions, substituting dependency for self-government?
Mises warns that this path, however well-intentioned, fundamentally corrodes character and undermines the moral fabric.
He offers a pretty stark psychological and even physiological warning here, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests that the fear of penury, the basic need to provide for oneself and one's family, is actually a vital factor in preserving human well-being. It impels people to stay fit, to work diligently, to plan for the future.
So if that natural pressure is removed entirely through government guarantees,
you risk replacing diligence with dependency, foresight with short-sightedness. It can lead, he feared, down a path towards a population accustomed to servitude, expecting sustenance from the state rather than through their own efforts. A kind of moral decay also feared by early American thinkers like Washington and Adams.
Okay, so we've established this tight link between economic structure, money, accountability, and moral character. This leads us to the synthesis in Part 5. The indivisibility of liberty and the dignity of action.
Yes. For Mises, The constitutional order of limited government and the market order of free exchange are not separate spheres. They are twin expressions of the exact same underlying truth.
Liberty is indivisible. You can't slice it up.
You can't. Restricting freedom in the economic realm inevitably endangers freedom in the political realm, and vice versa. Debasing the currency ultimately debases the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts.
And abandoning personal responsibility means abandoning freedom itself, in his view.
That's the core message. He attributed the political and economic catastrophes of the 20th century largely to an intellectual failure, what he called the revolt against reason.
A rejection of basic economic principles.
Yes, driven by ignorance or willful blindness about the essential role that economic freedom actually played in the incredible technological and social progress of the preceding centuries.
And we keep coming back to that philosophical battleground. Critics of the market try to dismiss economics itself,
calling it mere ideological superstructure, a tool of the bourgeoisie, or using those tactics like polylogism we discussed earlier.
Claiming different groups have different logics to silence inconvenient economic arguments about calculation or prices.
Right. But the rationalist framework Mises champions insists on universal reason as non-negotiable. If you reject the universally valid logical structure of human reason, the reality of causality, purpose, means, and ends, then you can't act rationally, you can't calculate, you can't cooperate effectively. Society breaks down.
So the enduring lesson of this massive book, Human Action, isn't really about charts and statistics, is it?
Not primarily, no. Those are just descriptions or outcomes. The fundamental subject is the dignity of the human person expressed through action.
Every purposeful choice, whether it's deciding what job to take, what to buy, how to produce something, inventing something new, reflects the human mind's creative power.
And the inherent human desire for improvement, for betterment, to move from that less satisfactory state to a more satisfactory one. When individuals are free to pursue their own improvement through voluntary action and cooperation,
civilization flourishes.
Yes. And when they are controlled, planned, managed from above, it decays and eventually collapses. Mises' treatise isn't just an economics textbook. It's a profound philosophical defense of human self-determination against coercion.
His conclusion is starkly clear then.
Hauntingly clear. The system of voluntary exchange, based on private property, sound money, and personal responsibility, is the only path where human freedom and sustainable prosperity can actually endure together.
And trying to substitute coercion for voluntary action, no matter how good the intentions seem,
is ultimately to destroy the very mechanism of human progress and life itself.
So if we take a step back from this monumental work, what's the timeless takeaway?
I think it's that central parallel Mises draws so powerfully. The U.S. Constitution, designed for political liberty, and the free market, the system for economic liberty, are twin expressions of the same core principle.
Liberty under law.
Exactly. Systems built on rules, not arbitrary rulers, recognizing human nature and channeling individual ambition towards cooperation, holding people accountable for their actions.
Mises showed us, with rigorous logic, why that freedom works, and why coercion must fail not just based on wishful thinking, but on the inescapable structure of human action itself.
The market economy isn't just one possible system. He argues it's the only system of complex social organization that can actually function rationally over the long term, because it aligns with reality, individual choice, scarcity, and the need for monetary calculation.
Okay, let's end with the provocative thought Mises himself offered, something for you, the listener, to really chew on. It's about the long-term survival of free systems.
Right. He observed that regardless of the form of government, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, the underlying philosophy and economic understanding of the majority ultimately tends to prevail.
How so?
Unpopular autocrats eventually get overthrown, often violently. Unpopular democratic governments get voted out peacefully. But in the long run, the dominant ideas shape the reality.
So this raises a really profound and maybe uncomfortable question for us today. If the majority of people don't accept or maybe don't even understand the basic principles of economics Mises laid out,
if they reject the function of prices or ignore the consequences of inflation or demand interventions that cripple calculation,
is the eventual slide towards despotism and economic collapse almost inevitable, regardless of how well-designed our initial political framework might be?
That's the disturbing implication. Mises suggests that because economics deals with the fundamental problems of social cooperation and survival, understanding it isn't just an academic pursuit. It's the primary and proper study of every citizen.
More important than voting, even.
He argues the most essential civic duty might be to familiarize oneself with the teachings of economics, because misunderstanding leads to policies that destroy the foundations of freedom and prosperity.
It's a really sobering challenge. The fate of liberty might not rest ultimately on founding documents or political structures, but on the intellectual battleground, on whether the public accepts economic reality.
That is the final heavy responsibility Mises seems to lay at our feet. The future depends on understanding.
A stunning challenge from a truly monumental work.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.